So these notes will be on public opinion. We'll start off with a definition of public opinion. It's what the public thinks about a particular issue or set of issues at any point in time. So public opinion is not just simply the opinion of the public. We are looking at the opinions of a group of citizens that have been identified by political scientists or leaders, and we want to know what their beliefs are on a particular issue, or we could even ask them about a group or setting of issues. And the key part of this definition is at any point in time, because it's important to know that if you're looking at public opinion poll results from 5 years ago, you can't assume that they still hold true today. So some early efforts to influence public opinion in our history. The Federalist Papers, of course, were written to influence opinion in favor of the ratification of the Constitution. Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet, again, another example of propaganda to break away from Great Britain and begin the revolution. And then you also see some efforts in World War I. America was very reluctant to abandon their neutrality and enter World War I. And so Woodrow Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, and it's through this committee that lots of propaganda, war posters are released, being frugal, meatless Mondays, things like that, to try to get people to support the war effort. And then in the 1920s, you have a political scientist named Walter Lippmann who becomes very concerned about the measurement of public opinion, and he believes that it needs to be done through scientific methods, that leaders are simply just talking to voters or reading letters or taking phone calls, and they're using that to kind of assess the opinion of the public, but it's not necessarily going to be accurate. It's just the opinion of those people that are writing letters and calling, and they're very different from the general population. So Lippmann became concerned that officials would place too much emphasis on those types of opinions and not develop any efforts to scientifically gather public opinion. So when we're analyzing public opinion, we are looking at several characteristics. The first is the intensity of the opinion. How strong a reaction does the respondent give when they're asked about this particular issue? Some issues are going to be more intense than others. Obviously, ones that are contentious or ones that are pretty divided or polarizing are going to have intense feelings from the respondent. The second characteristic we look at is latency. Is this an issue that isn't affecting the respondent right now, but it might later? So if I ask you about how you feel about unemployment insurance, but of course you're working, this isn't necessarily an issue that affects you, but it could affect you should you lose your job in the near future. We're also looking at the salience of the opinion. Is this person's opinion because the issue affects them personally? So if you ask them about gay marriage and they happen to be homosexual, obviously the issue is going to have very high salience for that person. We also look at whether or not there's a consensus on the opinion. Does 75% or more people agree on this issue? And that's usually very difficult, especially in the American public. There are certain things that we have a consensus on, like we all agree that we should have liberty and equality, but there are very few other issues that you can claim to have a consensus. And when you do have a consensus, it's very hard to ignore that if you're an elected official. Most of the time, though, what we have is polarization, where the public ends up split on important issues, and this is what makes it very difficult for the elected officials to then decide, well, how should we legislate this? What should we do about this issue when most people are very split on their opinion? We're looking at the stability of the opinion. So if we've taken a poll 5 years ago, are the results the same 5 years later? Or is the opinion fluid, meaning that the results are now different 5 years later? Is the opinion always changing? And a fluid opinion makes it hard for elected officials because they're trying to then figure out what to do about this particular issue. And if the public's opinion is always changing, how do they take a stand on it? So why do we form our political opinions? They come mainly, of course, from our personal beliefs. And one of the main factors that affects our personal beliefs is whether or not we can personally gain from this issue. So most Americans are pretty I-centered. If we're faced with policies that don't affect us personally, we have very difficult time forming an opinion. And so if you think about the opinions that you have on particular issues, think about how that opinion benefits you or your life or your values. Most likely it does, and that's one of the reasons you form that opinion. So on issues that don't really affect us, like foreign policy, we find it very difficult to form opinions. When Americans are asked, well, what should we do about the civil war in Sudan? Should we lend humanitarian aid, or should we keep troops in Iraq or Afghanistan? They don't really have as strong feelings about those issues as they do about things that, may affect them personally. Political knowledge also influences how opinions are formed. So we notice that the higher amount of political knowledge someone has, the more likely they are to participate in politics. The lower amount of political knowledge they have, the less participation they're going to have. So those two things have a direct relationship with one another. And we know that many Americans have low knowledge of history and politics. In fact, 37% of Americans can't even locate the United States on a map of the world, 37%. So clearly there's a lot of geographical illiteracy, lots of difficulty recalling basic facts about American history and the government. You only have to watch Jimmy Kimmel or Jay Leno to see some of the people out there on the street. So that makes it hard, because when you have a public that has low levels of knowledge, it makes them more ripe for manipulation. So it's one of the reasons why education, especially in a democracy, is so important, because it prevents the government from being able to manipulate the voting public to their particular point of view. So when you have low levels of knowledge, you can take a lot of your cues from leaders, and these can be elected officials. They can also be members of the media that have their own talk shows, for example. And when you don't have a lot of your own personal knowledge about an issue, you may be more likely to just agree with what someone you respect is saying. So for example, with the healthcare bill, and that bill was 1,000 pages. Americans aren't going to read that bill. They didn't know what was in it. And so they took their cues from leaders. What did their favorite media personality tell them about it? What did their elected official tell them about it? And that really helped to shape and form their opinions, which is not necessarily ideal. You want people to be educated and form their own opinions from facts and informations, and not from the opinions of other people. The president, of course, is in a huge position to mold public opinion. He commands the media. He can speak to us at any time. And often when he's having trouble getting Congress to see his way, he will take his message to the people in an attempt to mold their opinion to his favor and put pressure on Congress. But then you get your typical, chicken and egg argument. Who's really leading? Are we telling the president what we want him to work on and positions that we think he should hold? Or is he telling us what issues need to be addressed and what opinions we should hold? So how do we measure public opinion? We do it through public opinion polls, scientific public opinion polls. And so to give you an example, there's several steps that we first have to take to conduct a poll. The first thing we need to do is find out who we want the opinion of, okay? And that's our population. So if I wanted to know who the best teacher at Etowah was, my population would be all 2,300 students at Etowah. The problem is that I don't have time to ask all 2,300 students, nor would I be able to see them easily. So what political scientists do, or pollsters do, is they select a sample instead. But the sample has to be selected correctly in order for it to be representative. So if I just decided to ask my second period who the best teacher at Etowah was, and use them as my sample, that wouldn't be a scientific sample, and the results of my survey would not be valid. So one of the ways that we select a good sample is through random sampling. And so in random sampling, everyone in your population has to have an equal chance at being selected for your sample. So if I went down to the attendance office and got all 2,300 Etowah students' names and put them in a hat, and pulled out the first 100, I could use them as my random sample, and my results would be valid. Now, each person would have had an equal chance at being selected in my sample, right? A 1 in 2,300 chance. And so that's what makes it valid. But there's some problems with random sampling. For example, what if the 100 names I picked were all girls? Or what if they were all white? That's definitely not going to be representative of the population at Etowah. So instead, what people use are stratified samples. And so this is where if you have 40% of your population is women, then you need to make sure that 40% of your sample are women. If 20% of your population are African American, then 20% of your sample also need to be African American. And so stratified sampling really relieves a lot of the issues with random sampling, and it's preferred. So after we've selected our sample, the next thing we have to do is contact our respondents, and you have a variety of different methods. You can call, you can go in person, you can send a letter, you can send an email. There's really a variety of options, and obviously there's pros and cons. You know, going in person is certainly going to be expensive, whereas calling on the phone is definitely going to be a much cheaper method. Okay, so some other types of polls. One type of non-scientific poll is what's called a push poll. And a push poll is when the pollster pushes the respondent into a particular answer. Probably one of the most famous examples of this was done in 2000 when President George Bush, who was then just Governor Bush, was battling Senator John McCain for the Republican nomination to run for president in 2000. And Bush, really needed to win South Carolina to lock this up. And so the Bush campaign decided to use a push poll. They called voters in South Carolina and asked them how they would feel about John McCain's candidacy if they knew that he had had an illegitimate black granddaughter. Well, the thing was, the McCain campaign had recently released a McCain family picture, and McCain has an adopted granddaughter from Bangladesh who is very dark in skin color. And so when South Carolina respondents, again, low in political knowledge, were asked about this illegitimate black granddaughter, they put two and two together and figured that the dark-skinned girl they had seen in the family picture was in fact an illegitimate grandchild. And so that really soured South Carolinians to John McCain, and George Bush did win South Carolina pretty handedly, and that propelled him to the nomination. So that's kind of an example of a push poll. Another type of poll is a tracking poll. This is a scientific poll. Tracking polls are used by candidates to track their progress. How are they polling with women? Or how are they polling with whites? Or how are they polling with 18 to 24-year-olds? And so based on the information, the campaigns may make changes to the candidate's image or their speeches to reach out to those groups. Another type of scientific poll are exit polls. These are done on election day, and this is how we know who won the election before even a single vote is counted. So what media outlets will do is they will randomly select voting places throughout the United States, and they will send pollsters there. And as voters exit the polls, the pollster will ask them who they voted for and get some demographic information like their age, race, and gender. You know, sometimes it might be questionable. Their income and things of that nature. And then the news media outlet will then gather all that information from all their correspondents throughout the country, aggregate it, and they are then able to give the results of the election as soon as the polls close before a single vote has been counted due to these exit polls. So they really are a very useful tool. You can see the chart on the screen there, shows how accurate exit polls are. The Gallup organization, which is the world's largest polling organization, their exit poll results are in blue, and then the actual results after the votes have been counted are in red. And you can see for the most part, they're pretty spot on. You know, there's some misses, there's some anomalies there, but for the most part, they are very, very accurate. One other type of unscientific poll, which is not on the list here, is a straw poll. And a straw poll is very similar to the first example I gave you, of if I wanted to know who the best teacher at Etowah was, I would just ask my second period class. This is where you're not using a random scientific sample and you're just asking a group of people, and your responses, your answers are not going to be accurate in terms of being able to generalize to the entire population. But sometimes straw polls can be useful if you just want to know the opinion of the group that you're talking to. All right, so what are some problems with polling? Well, every poll should come with a sampling error or margin of error. This is reported in small print at the bottom of the poll. It'll say plus or minus and then a number, usually 5 or under. So this means that the results of the poll could be up by that number or down by that number. You don't want to look at a poll with a margin of error more than 5 because it's not going to be valid. Another problem with polling is the options for respondents to answer. Usually, when you are asked a polling question, the pollster has a list of answers that the respondent can choose. This is, of course, because we have to quantify and generalize them. The best way to do it, of course, would be to let the respondent use their own words to express their beliefs. But then you're going to have 100 unique answers, and what do you do with that as a statistician? So usually there'll be a series of options they can choose from, but the options may be limited and not necessarily reflect the respondent's true opinion. Also, lack of information is going to be an issue. When people are asked their opinion about an issue that they don't understand or know about, they're not going to ask the pollster to explain it to them because they're embarrassed. So they'll just answer, but their answer may not be accurate, of course, because they don't know what they're being asked. The wording of questions, you need to make sure the question is not biased. You can't, want someone's opinion on abortion with a question that says, abortion is murder. How do you feel about it? Okay, that's clearly going to be biased and lead the respondent to a particular response. So how does polling actually affect politicians and the laws that they pass? We know that the politicians and the government spend literally millions of dollars every year on polling. We know they rely on polls, but we don't know to what degree. How much importance do they place on the results of polls of their constituents? How much does it drive, how they decide to vote on bills? We really just don't know. That'd be an interesting master's thesis or dissertation. We also know that polling can distort the election process. The media is constantly during a campaign reporting who's ahead and who's down in the polls. No one wants to be on a losing team, right? And so sometimes this exacerbates the bandwagon effect, and voters will actually jump onto the bandwagon of the candidate that's polling ahead in the polls. And so that can be a problem, of course. Recent efforts to measure public opinion. So in the 1940s, you have polling techniques becoming more sophisticated. You have the advent of scientific polling using actual random sampling. The Gallup organization was the leader in that. You can go on their website and they have polling results from literally thousands of different issues. The National Election Study is a study that is conducted every 4 years out of the University of Michigan. They call hundreds of voters, ask them who they voted for in the last election, and they get a lot of demographic information about them. And this is really like a treasure chest of data for political scientists who are writing papers or books and on the voting behavior of the public. And then, of course, the internet, you'll have internet polls and whatnot. But unless they're using a random sample, those are generally not very, very accurate. Okay? And that is public opinion.